Chapter 3. A Love Affair of Long Ago. I thought that probably my connection with Cranford would cease after Miss Jenkins's death. At least that it would have to be kept up by correspondence, which bears much the same relation to personal intercourse that the books of dried plants I sometimes see, hortus siccus I think they call the thing, do to the living and fresh flowers in the lanes and meadows. I was pleasantly surprised, therefore, by receiving a letter from Miss Pole, who had always come in for a supplementary week after my annual visit to Miss Jenkins, proposing that I should go and stay with her. And then, in a couple of days after my acceptance, came a note from Miss Matty, in which, in a rather circuitous and very humble manner, she told me how much pleasure I should confer if I could spend a week or two with her, either before or after I had been at Miss Pole's. For, she said, since my dear sister's death, I am well aware I have no attractions to offer. It is only to the kindness of my friends that I can owe their company. Of course, I promised to come to dear Miss Matty as soon as I had ended my visit to Miss Pole, and the day after my arrival at Cranford, I went to see her, much wondering what the house would be like without Miss Jenkins, and rather dreading the changed aspect of things. Miss Matty began to cry as soon as she saw me. She was evidently nervous from having anticipated my call. I comforted her as well as I could, and I found the best consolation I could give was the honest praise that came from my heart as I spoke of the deceased. Miss Matty slowly shook her head over each virtue as it was named and attributed to her sister, and at last she could not restrain the tears which had long been silently flowing, but hid her face behind her handkerchief and sobbed aloud. "Dear Miss Matty," said I, taking her hand, for indeed I did not know in what way to tell her how sorry I was for her, left deserted in the world. She put down her handkerchief and said, "My dear, I'd rather you did not call me Matty. She did not like it, but I did many a thing she did not like, I'm afraid, and now she's gone. If you please, my love, will you call me Matilda?" I promised faithfully and began to practice the new name with Miss Pole that very day. And, by degrees, Miss Matilda's feeling on the subject was known through Cranford, and we all tried to drop the more familiar name, but with so little success that by and by we gave up the attempt. My visit to Miss Pole was very quiet. Miss Jenkins had so long taken the lead in Cranford that now she was gone, they hardly knew how to give a party. The Honorable Mrs. Jameson, to whom Miss Jenkins herself had always yielded the post of honor, was fat and inert and very much at the mercy of her old servants. If they chose that she should give a party, they reminded her of the necessity for so doing. If not, she let it alone. There was all the more time for me to hear old-world stories from Miss Pole, while she sat knitting and I making my father's shirts. I always took a quantity of plain sewing to Cranford, for, as we did not read much or walk much, I found it a capital time to get through my work. One of Miss Pole's stories related to a shadow of a love affair that was dimly perceived or suspected long years before. Presently, the time arrived when I was to remove to Miss Matilda's house. I found her timid and anxious about the arrangements for my comfort. Many a time, while I was unpacking, did she come backwards and forwards to stir the fire, which burned all the worse for being so frequently poked. "Have you drawers enough, dear?" asked she. I don't know exactly how my sister used to arrange them. She had capital methods. I am sure she would have trained a servant in a week to make a better fire than this, and Fanny has been with me 4 months. This subject of servants was a standing grievance, and I could not wonder much at it, for if gentlemen were scarce and almost unheard of in the genteel society of Cranford, they or their counterparts, handsome young men, abounded in the lower classes. The pretty, neat servant maids had their choice of desirable followers, and their mistresses, without having the sort of mysterious dread of men and matrimony that Miss Matilda had, might well feel a little anxious lest the heads of their comely maids should be turned by the joiner or the butcher or the gardener, who were obliged by their callings to come to the house, and who, as ill luck would have it, were generally handsome and unmarried. Fanny's lovers, if she had any, and Miss Matilda suspected her of so many flirtations that if she had not been very pretty, I should have doubted her having one, were a constant anxiety to her mistress. She was forbidden by the articles of her engagement to have followers. And though she had answered, innocently enough, doubling up the hem of her apron as she spoke, "Please, ma'am, I never had more than one at a time," Miss Matty prohibited that one. But a vision of a man seemed to haunt the kitchen. Fanny assured me that it was all fancy, or else I should have said myself that I had seen a man's coat-tails whisk into the scullery once when I went on an errand into the storeroom at night. And another evening, when, our watches having stopped, I went to look at the clock, there was a very odd appearance, singularly like a young man, squeezed up between the clock and the back of the open kitchen door. And I thought Fanny snatched up the candle very hastily so as to throw the shadow on the clock face, while she very positively told me the time half an hour too early, as we found out afterwards by the church clock. But I did not add to Miss Matty's anxieties by naming my suspicions, especially as Fanny said to me the next day that it was such a queer kitchen for having odd shadows about it. She really was almost afraid to stay. "For you know, miss," she added, "I don't see a creature from 6 o'clock tea till Mrs. rings the bell for prayers at 10. However, it so fell out that Fanny had to leave, and Miss Matilda begged me to stay and settle her with the new maid, to which I consented after I had heard from my father that he did not want me at home. The new servant was a rough, honest-looking country girl who had only lived in a farm place before, but I liked her looks when she came to be hired, and I promised Miss Matilda to put her in the ways of the house. The said ways religiously such as Miss Matilda thought her sister would approve. Many a domestic rule and regulation had been a subject of plaintive whispered murmur to me during Miss Jenkins's life, but now that she was gone, I do not think that even I, who was a favorite, durst have suggested an alteration. To give an instance, we constantly adhered to the forms which were observed at meal times in my father the rector's house. Accordingly, we had always wine and dessert, but the decanters were only filled when there was a party, and what remained was seldom touched, though we had 2 wine-glasses apiece every day after dinner, until the next festive occasion arrived, when the state of the remainder wine was examined into in a family council. The dregs were often given to the poor, but occasionally, when a good deal had been left at the last party, 5 months ago it might be, it was added to some of a fresh bottle, brought up from the cellar. I fancy poor Captain Brown did not much like wine, for I noticed he never finished his first glass, and most military men take several. Then, as to our dessert, Miss Jenkins used to gather currants and gooseberries for it herself, which I sometimes thought would have tasted better fresh from the trees. But then, as Miss Jenkins observed, there would be nothing for dessert in summer-time. As it was, we felt very genteel with our 2 glasses apiece, and a dish of gooseberries at the top, of currants and biscuits at the sides, and 2 decanters at the bottom. When oranges came in, a curious proceeding was gone through. Miss Jenkins did not like to cut the fruit, for, as she observed, the juice all ran out nobody knew where. Sucking, only I think she used some more recondite word, was in fact the only way of enjoying oranges. But then there was the unpleasant association with a ceremony frequently gone through by little babies. And so, after dessert, in orange season, Miss Jenkins and Miss Matty used to rise up, possess themselves each of an orange in silence, and withdraw to the privacy of their own rooms to indulge in sucking oranges. I had once or twice tried on such occasions to prevail on Miss Matty to stay, and had succeeded in her sister's lifetime. I held up a screen and did not look, and as she said, she tried not to make the noise very offensive. But now that she was left alone, she seemed quite horrified when I begged her to remain with me in the warm dining parlor, and enjoy her orange as she liked best. And so it was in everything. Miss Jenkins's rules were made more stringent than ever, because the framer of them was gone where there could be no appeal. In all else, Miss Matilda was meek and undecided to a fault. I have heard Fanny turn her round 20 times in a morning about dinner, just as the little hussy chose, and I sometimes fancied she worked on Miss Matilda's weakness in order to bewilder her and to make her feel more in the power of her clever servant. I determined that I would not leave her till I had seen what sort of a person Martha was, and if I found her trustworthy, I would tell her not to trouble her mistress with every little decision. Martha was blunt and plain-spoken to a fault. Otherwise, she was a brisk, well-meaning, but very ignorant girl. She had not been with us a week before Miss Matilda and I were astounded one morning by the receipt of a letter from a cousin of hers, who had been 20 or 30 years in India, and who had lately, as we had seen by the army list, returned to England, bringing with him an invalid wife who had never been introduced to her English relations. Major Jenkins wrote to propose that he and his wife should spend a night at Cranford on his way to Scotland, at the inn if it did not suit Miss Matilda to receive them into her house, in which case they should hope to be with her as much as possible during the day. Of course it must suit her, as she said, for all Cranford knew that she